London is wrapped in fog, and where others see chaos, he finds the truth. The legendary detective Sherlock Holmes is back in the game. Welcome to the channel. Put on your headphones and unravel new mysteries alongside him. A thick London fog pressed against the windows of Baker Street that evening, the sort of woolly grey shroud that wrapped itself about the gas lamps and muffled the clatter of passing hansoms. I had gone to visit Holmes, simply to share a quiet supper and perhaps a pipe before retiring early. Yet, as was so often the case, my friend's restless mind had summoned a mystery even before I had removed my gloves. Holmes stood at the hearth, one hand resting on the mantelpiece, the other holding a copy of the Daily Telegraph. The paper was folded to a small column near the bottom of the page, and Holmes's keen grey eyes flicked over it with a peculiar narrowed intensity. "Watson," he said without looking up, "do read this." I took the paper, expecting news of some celebrated burglary or political scandal. Yet the article was almost laughably mundane. A short notice announcing that Edwin Harrow, a middle-aged clerk of modest means, had been found dead in his rented room in Islington. The cause was stated as a heart attack. Tragic, but hardly unusual. I read the item twice, puzzled. "Holmes, I see nothing remarkable here." "Precisely," he replied. "And yet, either the universe has elected to play an elaborate joke upon Scotland Yard, or someone is attempting to stage an impossibility." He walked to his desk, where a second newspaper lay open. He tapped the central headline. "Read that one, if you please." This article, from that very afternoon's edition, was far less ordinary. It declared that Edwin Harrow, clerk, had been found murdered, his body discovered in a derelict warehouse near the Thames docks. There were no suspicions of a heart attack here. The man had been stabbed, and the coroner's report suggested a struggle. I frowned deeply. "A coincidence of names?" Holmes shook his head. "Lestrade sent me word. Both bodies are the same man." The fog outside seemed to thicken in response, rolling against the window panes like slow surf. A man dead of natural causes, then dead again by violence. Holmes could not have devised a more tantalizing paradox. Naturally, I peppered him with questions. Holmes raised a hand to quiet me. "I shall present the known facts in proper order." He lit his pipe and began his account with the cool precision I had witnessed in so many of his investigations. Early that morning, Lestrade had visited him in considerable agitation. The Yard had received complaints about improper handling of remains at an Islington boarding house. Yet before they could even address that, a second report arrived from the Thames Division. A clerk's body discovered under decidedly sinister circumstances. When the name Harrow appeared in both reports, an officer suggested error or coincidence, until medical personnel examined both bodies together and confirmed they matched in every visible detail. They concluded, Holmes said, that either London has produced a perfect double at the very hour of the man's death, or his death has been staged not once, but twice. A log sputtered in the fireplace, sending sparks up the flue. "Holmes," I murmured, "you surely do not propose—" "I propose nothing yet," he cut in. "But I do observe that the Islington boarding house claims the first Harrow died quietly in his bed. Meanwhile, the dockside warehouse suggests violence and haste. Such contradictions rarely arise from chance." He took a slow draw on his pipe. "Moreover, Harrow appears to have lived a life of dull regularity. A clerk at Wilkes and Trent, minimal acquaintances, no known quarrels, not even a debt to his name. It is among such ordinary folk that the darkest puzzles often lurk. Holmes moved to the window, brushing the curtains aside to peer into the smothering fog. Watson, a man cannot die twice, unless someone has gone to extraordinary lengths to insist that he has. I felt that familiar thrill of stepping once more into the unknown with him. The room, though warm, seemed touched by a faint chill, as though the mystery had slipped inside with the fog. Holmes turned sharply. "We go to Islington at once. The first scene of death is always the most innocent, and therefore the most dangerous to ignore." I snatched up my coat, for there was no resisting him when he spoke in such a tone. As we descended the steps of 221B, a street lamp flickered, casting wavering shadows across the pavement. Our cab waited at the curb, its lantern glowing weakly in the mist. Before I climbed in, I glanced up at the dim outline of the building behind us. Holmes, already settled in his seat, tapped his cane impatiently. "Come, Watson. The dead may not speak, but their rooms often do, and I should very much like to hear what Mr. Edwin Harrow left unsaid." With that, the cab lurched into the fog, carrying us toward the quiet house where a man had died once, or perhaps twice, setting in motion a mystery that seemed already to defy the very nature of life and death. The hansom carried us eastward through the clinging fog, its wheels muffled on the wet roadway. Holmes sat rigidly, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his eyes fixed upon a point far beyond the dim silhouette of the horse. I knew better than to interrupt his thoughts when he lapsed into such a state. The machinery of his mind was already turning over the few grains of evidence we possessed, grinding them until they yielded something useful. We arrived in Islington at a modest boarding house, whose narrow frontage leaned slightly forward, as if trying to eavesdrop upon the street. A thin sliver of light glowed behind the door's frosted glass. Holmes rapped sharply, and after a long moment, a woman of severe countenance opened the door. Her greying hair was pinned tightly at the nape, and her eyes darted between us with the quick, nervous movements of a bird. "Mrs. Penbury?" Holmes inquired. "Yes, sir," she replied. "Are you with the police?" "No, madam," Holmes said, "but acting with their full approval. We have come regarding Mr. Harrow." At the mention of the name, she pressed her lips together and stepped aside to let us in. The hallway smelled faintly of paraffin and boiled cabbage. She led us up a narrow staircase that groaned beneath our steps, stopping at the second door on the left. "He was a quiet man," she said, lowering her voice. "Never a complaint from anyone. Paid on time every week. Then this dreadful business." Holmes inclined his head. "Do you recall anything unusual in his behavior during the days preceding his passing?" Mrs. Penbury shook her head. "He came home at his usual hour, ate little supper, and went to bed. That was all. The doctor said his heart gave out in the night." Holmes asked no further questions for the moment. Instead, he produced a small lantern from his coat and stepped into the room. I had expected signs of disorder or of illness, disheveled clothes, a half-finished meal, perhaps some letters left by a man sensing impending weakness. Instead, the room was meticulously tidy. A narrow bed, neatly made, a small writing desk with all its drawers closed, a washstand with its jug and basin in perfect order. It It was the room of a man who lived quietly, perhaps even cautiously. Holmes went first to the bedside. "This is where he was found?" "Yes, sir," Mrs. Penbury replied from the doorway. "No disturbance at all." Holmes crouched, inspecting the floorboards, then the bed frame, then the pillow with a slow, methodical eye. He lifted the pillow, pressed his palm against its center, sniffed, then replaced it without comment. He moved next to the writing desk, running his fingertips along the wood. Then, with a movement so light it scarcely seemed more than a gesture, he flicked open the top drawer. Inside were a few sheets of blank paper, a cheap fountain pen, a small bottle of ink, and a folded receipt. Holmes unfolded it, glanced at it briefly, and tucked it into his pocket. "Did the police search this room thoroughly?" he asked. Mrs. Penbury nodded. "They said there was nothing to suggest foul play." "Quite," Holmes murmured. "That is often the difficulty." He turned to the window. It was latched from the inside. The sill bore no marks of tampering or dirt. A man dying peacefully in bed leaves no footprints, no broken furniture, no cry in the night. It was the perfect picture of a natural death. Too perfect. Holmes next inspected the washstand. He lifted the jug, examined the bottom, then the basin, dipping a fingertip into the slight residue of dried water. He sniffed, frowned faintly, and wiped his hand on his handkerchief. "Mrs. Penbury," he said without looking back, "did Mr. Harrow send out for anything on the evening before his death? A parcel? A message? Perhaps a bottle of some tonic?" "No, sir. Nothing of the kind." "Very well. Watson, if you please, observe the interior of the basin." I leaned closer. At first, I saw nothing but faint watermarks. Then, under Holmes's lantern, I noticed a barely visible pale ring, almost chalky in texture. "Soap residue," I suggested. "Not soap," Holmes replied. "Something else entirely." He said no more. When Holmes withheld an explanation, it meant he lacked only one or two missing pieces before revealing the entire mechanism of the puzzle. He crossed the room once more and knelt beside the foot of the bed. With the thin blade of his penknife, he gently prized up one floorboard. Underneath was a hollow. In it lay another receipt, its paper crumpled as though shoved in hastily. Holmes opened it, inspected it briefly, and handed it to me. "From a chemist," I said. "A purchase of ammonium nitrate." Holmes nodded. "Not a household item for a quiet clerk." Mrs. Penbury gasped. "I had no notion he might be dealing with dangerous substances." "We do not yet know what he intended," Holmes said calmly. "Fear not, madam. The danger is less in the substance than in the motive for acquiring it." He replaced the floorboard with care. Holmes then stood and surveyed the room once more. He said quietly, almost to himself, "A man dies in utter tranquility, yet possesses materials more suited to a forger or smuggler than a clerk. A man seemingly solitary, yet two bodies appear, and now receipts concealed in clever places. Curious, very curious." At last he turned to Mrs. Penbury. "We shall trouble you no further tonight. Mr. Harrow's affairs, I fear, are far from simple." She wrung her hands. "Will there be danger for the other lodgers, sir?" Holmes gave her a reassuring smile. "None whatsoever. If any danger existed here, it passed with the unfortunate gentleman." As we left the house and stepped once more into the suffocating fog, I could not help asking, "Holmes, what do you make of the receipts?" "A code," he said simply, "and perhaps a partnership." With whom? That, Watson, remains to be discovered. We now go to the second scene, where Mr. Harrow met his other death. There, I expect, the silence will speak far more loudly. A chill passed through me, though the fog seemed no colder than before. The hansom approached through the dimness, its lantern swaying. Holmes climbed in, tapping the roof impatiently. "The docks," he instructed the driver. "And quickly, if you value your fare." As the horse pulled us into the night, I realized the case was no longer merely curious. It had begun to take on the shape of something far more sinister, something lurking beneath London's respectable facade. Holmes's sharp profile was lit faintly by the blurred glow of the street lamps, and though he said nothing, I sensed he already heard the faintest whisper of truth calling from the river. The hansom made slow progress as we neared the river. Even the horse seemed reluctant to enter the maze of narrow, mist-choked lanes that wound toward the docks. The Thames has a peculiar smell at night, oily, metallic, and faintly rotten, and that odour grew stronger with every turn of the wheels. Holmes leaned forward, his posture alert, his eyes glinting through the fog. We arrived at a deserted wharf where a police constable, coat collar turned up against the damp, approached us. Recognizing Holmes, he straightened at once. "Inspector Lestrade left word," the man said. "You're to have full access." Holmes nodded. "The warehouse?" "Ahead, sir. We've locked it since the removal of the body." The warehouse loomed like a dark, hulking beast, its roof slanting unevenly, its boards shriveled with age. The constable unlocked the heavy door, and its hinges groaned as we stepped inside. Our lantern cast a feeble circle of light on the floorboards, which were rough and scattered with splinters. "Here," the constable said, pointing to a spot near the center of the room. "That's where they found him." Holmes knelt immediately, the hem of his coat brushing the dusty floor. I stood nearby, peering over his shoulder as he examined the planks with a meticulous thoroughness, brushing aside debris, sniffing at faint marks, tapping lightly with his fingertips. "Bloodstain," he murmured. I saw only a faint, rust-colored shadow. "Rather old, Holmes," I remarked. "Not as old as you believe," he replied. "The dust on it is recent." He moved the lantern. Small scratches became visible around the stain, marks that might have been left by a boot sliding in a struggle. Holmes rose and paced slowly around the perimeter of the warehouse, pausing frequently to examine the walls. At one point, he stopped so abruptly that I nearly collided with him. "Observe, Watson," he said, pointing to a patch of wood near the door. "Someone removed a plank some days prior." "How can you tell?" "The color. This section is cleaner, as though the dust had been brushed away, and the edges show pressure from nails inserted and removed repeatedly. This place was not simply a location of murder. It was used for some secret purpose." Holmes then turned sharply toward the constable. "You saw the body?" "Yes, sir. Looked like he'd been dead only a short while. A knife wound to the side." "And no sign of robbery?" "None. His pockets still had a few coins. Nothing else." Holmes walked to the far corner of the warehouse, where the floorboards sagged slightly. He crouched again, this time inhaling deeply the air just above the wood. "Chemicals," he said. "Traces of the same substance we found in Harrow's wash basin." "Ammonium nitrate?" I asked. "Partially, mixed with something else, perhaps sulfuric residue, two common elements among counterfeiters and smugglers." I felt a tremor run through me. "Then Harrow was involved." Holmes shook his head. Involved? Yes. But willingly? That remains doubtful. There is something too innocent about his lodgings, too unprepared about his first death. He tapped the floorboards lightly. This place, however, reeks of preparation. The constable shifted uneasily. There's more, sir. A sailor claimed he saw 2 men enter this warehouse late the night before the body was found. Holmes straightened at once. Did he give a description? One was tall, the other shorter, both wearing coats with their collars high. He couldn't see their faces in the fog. Holmes dismissed him with a nod and returned to his silent inspection. At last, he stood in the center of the warehouse, arms folded, head bowed slightly, a posture I had come to recognize as the moment he began assembling the pieces in his mind. "Watson," he said at last, "we now have 2 scenes of death, neither of which bears the hallmarks of a simple conclusion. The boarding house shows no disturbance, no struggle, and yet Harrow possessed receipts for chemicals. The warehouse shows violence, chemical traces, and the clear presence of at least 2 other men. Yet both bodies are, by all reports, the same." He began pacing slowly, his voice taking on its familiar analytical tone. "One body dies quietly, another violently. Yet the police swear both corpses are identical. That is impossible unless one of 2 things occurred. Either Harrow has an exact double, or someone has taken extraordinary measures to mislead the coroner." "Holmes," I said, "surely no imposter could fool a medical professional." "Under normal circumstances, no. But suppose the imposter himself was dead. Suppose the intention was not to fool the living, but to close the affair swiftly by overwhelming the yard with contradiction." The idea sent a shiver down my spine. But why go to such lengths? Holmes stopped pacing. "That, my dear Watson, is the heart of the matter." He stepped again to the center of the warehouse. "There is more. The dust around this bloodstain is disturbed in a peculiar pattern. 2 sets of footprints, one dragging another. And yet there is a 3rd set by the back wall." He knelt, showing me faint impressions visible only at certain angles under the lantern light. "One man carried another," Holmes said, "but a 2nd man watched from the wall. Then all 3 departed, or 2 departed, leaving the 3rd behind as a corpse. The fog pressed against the cracks in the warehouse, like some living creature trying to slip inside." "Watson," Holmes said quietly, "consider the timing. Harrow died in Islington 2 days ago, but the body found here was fresh. Who then was the man who died peacefully, and who died violently?" Before I could answer, he stood abruptly. "Enough. We must speak with Harrow's employer at Wilkes and Trent. A man does not hide chemical receipts unless he expects inquiry. Someone at his office knows what role he played." As we left the warehouse, closing the heavy door behind us, the Thames wind cut through my coat, sharper than before. Holmes strode ahead through the fog with the speed of one who already sensed the shape of the truth. I hurried to keep pace, feeling the weight of the mystery settle ever deeper into my thoughts. Somewhere in London, someone knew why Edwin Harrow's life had unraveled into 2 deaths, and Holmes intended to uncover that truth before another body joined the tally. The next morning broke cold and colourless, the kind of pale London day when the sun seems reluctant to rise above the chimney pots. I met Holmes in our sitting room, where he was already dressed, gloved, and poring over Bradshaw's tables with the zeal of a man assembling a complex puzzle. Without looking up, he said, We go to Wilkes and Trent at once. Their clerk's employer will either open the gate to this mystery or attempt to shut it in our faces. In either case, we shall learn something of value. We stepped out onto Baker Street, where a brittle frost clung to the paving stones. A cab was hailed, and within minutes we were rattling toward the financial district. Holmes spent the journey in silence, his eyes half closed, his lips compressed in that thin line which signaled deep concentration. Wilkes and Trent occupied a tall, narrow building of soot-darkened brick. Its brass plate shone brightly. Too brightly, I thought, for a firm of such modest reputation. Inside, a weary-eyed young clerk directed us upstairs to a cramped office smelling faintly of ink and ledger dust. Behind a small desk sat Mr. Charles Trent, a slight man with thinning hair, round spectacles, and a mild manner that bordered on the apologetic. He rose when we entered. "Mr. Holmes, Inspector Lestrade sent word you might call. Terrible business about poor Harrow. Most distressing." Holmes bowed politely. "We would like to ask you a few questions regarding his duties." Of course," Trent said, wringing his hands. "The Yard has already taken his workbox and examined his ledger entries. I fear you will find nothing more." Holmes drew up a chair and sat, his posture composed yet alert. "Mr. Trent, did Mr. Harrow handle chemical purchases?" Trent blinked. "Chemicals? Good heavens, no. We are mere brokers. Paperwork, shipping confirmations, the occasional customs declaration. Nothing of the sort." Holmes produced from his pocket the receipt we had found beneath the floorboard. "Do you recognize this?" Trent adjusted his spectacles. "A chemist on Gray's Inn Road. Ammonium nitrate." "No, Mr. Holmes. This is entirely outside our business." Holmes watched him carefully, his gaze sharp. "Did you notice any change in Harrow during the weeks prior to his death? Any unusual absences? New acquaintances?" "None whatsoever," Trent answered. "He was punctual, diligent, quiet to a fault. A man hardly worth remarking upon, and I mean no insult by that. He simply blended into the background." Holmes stood and walked to the window. "And yet, he completed his work so satisfactorily that you entrusted him with customs documentation." Yes. Routine forms, nothing sensitive. Harrow was trustworthy." Holmes turned sharply. "Trustworthy enough to be given access to the warehouse down by Shadwell?" Trent paled visibly. "Warehouse? Shadwell? No, certainly not. We own no property near the docks." Holmes took 3 measured steps toward Trent. "Are you quite sure, Mr. Trent? Because the warehouse in which Mr. Harrow, or a man believed to be him, was murdered bears markings consistent with your firm's crates." Trent's mouth dropped open. "That cannot be. We have crates stored only in the King's Cross depot, no other location." Holmes leaned a hand lightly on the man's desk. "I advise you to think carefully, Mr. Trent. Was any employee or partner using your firm's name for private dealings?" Trent swallowed hard. No, I don't believe so. We are but 3 clerks and myself. Nothing of value passes through our hands." Holmes turned away. "Value comes in many forms, Mr. Trent. Sometimes it is not the object itself, but the illusion of authority surrounding it." As we left the office, I said quietly, "Holmes, you rattled him." "He rattled himself, Watson. A truthful man stammers from shock. A guilty man stammers from fear. Mr. Trent displayed both reactions, but neither fully." "Meaning he is hiding something?" "Meaning," Holmes said, "he knows more than he realizes. or less than he pretends. We had just reached the street when a figure hurried toward us. A young clerk, the same one who had shown us upstairs. "Mr. Holmes," he whispered urgently. "May I have a word? Away from the building, I beg you." Holmes raised an eyebrow and gestured for him to continue down the street. When we reached a quiet alley, the clerk spoke in a low, almost trembling voice. "My name's Henry Fletcher, sir. I overheard part of Mr. Trent's conversation with you. There's something you should know about Mr. Harrow." Holmes listened intently. "About 3 weeks ago," Fletcher said, "Harrow started receiving letters, thick envelopes. He hid them quickly, but not quickly enough. I noticed the return address on one." Holmes leaned forward. "And it was from a man named Samuel Richter." The name meant nothing to me, but Holmes's expression sharpened instantly. "You know him?" I asked. "A notorious smuggler," Holmes replied. "A figure rarely glimpsed yet often suspected in cases involving forged manifests and falsified customs papers." Fletcher nodded anxiously. I thought it odd, but Harrow kept his head down and worked as usual. Then one evening he went out early, carrying a small satchel. When he returned, he locked it in his desk. Mr. Trent never knew. "Do you know where Harrow went?" Holmes asked. "No, sir. Only that he seemed troubled, frightened even. I tried to ask if he was unwell, but he brushed me off." Holmes placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. "You have been of great assistance, Mr. Fletcher. Say nothing of our conversation." The clerk nodded and hurried away. Holmes turned to me at once. "We now have a name, Watson. Richter is the key to this affair. If Harrow became entangled in his operations, even unwittingly, he may have been a liability. Then the motive for murder becomes clear." Holmes shook his head. "Partially. But we still possess 2 bodies, not one. And until we understand that contradiction, the truth remains incomplete." A cold wind gusted down the street, scattering scraps of paper and sending a shiver through my coat. Holmes tucked his hands behind his back and began pacing. "Richter will not be found by simple inquiry. He lives in the shadowed corners of London where the law seldom reaches. But his associates leave traces. We must speak with Lestrade at once and obtain what information the Yard possesses about Richter's movements." We made our way toward Scotland Yard, yet Holmes walked with a speed that suggested the case had accelerated in his mind. The discovery of a connection between Harrow and a known smuggler had tightened the threads of the mystery, but it had also introduced a new and troubling possibility. Holmes stopped abruptly on the pavement. "Watson," he said, "if Harrow received letters from Richter, and if he went to meet him, then the man who died peacefully in his bed may not have been Harrow at all. Or rather, Harrow may not have been the only Harrow." The implication struck me like a physical blow. "Holmes, do you mean—" "A double, Watson. A twin. Or a man who could pass convincingly as him. Until we inspect the coroner's reports ourselves, we cannot dismiss the possibility." The fog, returning once more as the morning waned, curled around us like a silent spectator. Holmes stared into it, his eyes bright with a certainty he had not yet spoken. "Come," he said quietly. "The dead have told us their first secret. Now we must coax the second from them before Richter does." Scotland Yard was unusually busy when we arrived, its corridors humming with the dour energy of policemen wrestling with the endless problems London produced. Lestrade met us in his cramped office, where stacks of paperwork threatened to topple onto the single chair he cleared for me with a weary sigh. "Holmes," he said, loosening his collar. "I hear you've been poking about in Harrow's affairs. I'd hoped this case would turn simple once we got the second body delivered. But blast it all, it's only grown stranger." Holmes seated himself lightly on the edge of Lestrade's desk, a posture which always irritated the inspector, yet commanded his involuntary respect. "Lestrade," he said, "you mentioned yesterday the coroner's certainty that the bodies were identical. I would like to see the reports." Lestrade opened a drawer, rummaged, and produced 2 thin files, which he handed over with no small reluctance. "You'll see what I mean. Dr. Collingridge examined them both. Same age, same height, same scars. One on the right forearm, one behind the left ear. If they're not the same man, then I'll eat my hat." Holmes flipped through the pages with quick, bird-like motions. He paused, frowning, and tapped a paragraph. "Look here, Watson," he said. "The scar behind the ear, approximately half an inch." "Half an inch on both bodies," Lestrade added. Holmes shook his head. "Not identical. One scar is described as older, more faded. The other as recent, less healed." Lestrade blinked. "But surely, my dear Lestrade, even you see the impossibility," Holmes said with a faint smile. "2 scars of identical location but differing age do not belong to one man, but to 2. Dr. Collingridge noted the difference, yet dismissed it." Lestrade groaned. "Twins, then? Heaven help us, Holmes. Why didn't you say so yesterday?" "I did," Holmes murmured, though perhaps not loudly enough. He snapped the report shut. Harrow had a twin brother, or someone near enough in appearance to him to serve the smuggler's purpose. One died quietly, the other violently. Which was which remains to be seen. Lestrade rubbed his temples. "I'll have my men search for records, birth, baptism, anything." "You will find nothing," Holmes replied. "If the brothers wished secrecy, or if their upbringing involved irregular circumstances, official records would be sparse. No, our true quarry is Samuel Richter." At the mention of the name, Lestrade straightened sharply. "You've learned about him then? Nasty fellow. Hard to catch. We've tried to pin half the illegal paperwork along the river on him, but he slips like an eel." Holmes nodded. "Then we must find the rock under which he hides. Tell me what you have." Lestrade pulled another file, much thicker, onto the desk. "Richter operates in shadows. He rarely appears himself, uses intermediaries, changes lodgings often. The last confirmed sighting was near Mill Wharf 3 months ago." Holmes scanned the notes, then closed the file. "Watson, do you recall the chemical traces in the warehouse?" "Yes, ammonium nitrate mixed with something else." "Exactly. A substance often used to age paper artificially. If someone wished to forge customs documents so they appeared older, they might employ such a mixture." Lestrade whistled. "So, Harrow, whichever Harrow, may have been mixed up with forged manifests." "And paid for it with his life," Holmes added. I leaned forward. "But why kill both brothers?" Holmes's expression darkened. "Because the surviving brother may have known too much." He stood abruptly. "Lestrade, I need access to the warehouse once more before sunset. There is something I suspect we missed. You would do well to send a man to keep watch on Wilkes and Trent. If Richter learns we are sniffing at his heels, the office may grow suddenly lively." Lestrade nodded grimly. I'll see to it. Holmes and I left the yard with brisk steps, though the afternoon had already sunk into that wintry dullness which robbed London's streets of colour. A sullen mist clung to the rooftops as we made our way toward a cab. "Holmes," I said as we boarded, "why return to the warehouse? We searched it thoroughly." "Thoroughly for a policeman, Watson, not thoroughly for a smuggler." He gave the driver a sharp command. Back to Shadwell. The journey was slow, the fog thickening with every turning street. By the time we reached the river, the lamps glowed like small, trembling suns trapped in clouded glass. Inside the warehouse, the air felt colder than before, as if the river's breath seeped through the walls. Holmes paced the length of the room, stopping now and then to crouch and run his fingertips along the floorboards. "Watson," he said at last, "fetch the lantern." I lifted it, bringing its glow closer. "Here," Holmes murmured, pressing lightly on two adjacent boards. "Do you feel the shift?" Indeed, the boards moved ever so slightly, far more than the others. Holmes knelt and, with a deft motion of his knife, prized one up. Beneath lay a shallow cavity. Inside were papers, dozens of them, folded manifests, customs declarations, bills of lading. Some bore official seals. Others looked uncanny, too new, too stiff. Holmes lifted one, holding it between finger and thumb. "Forgeries," he said. "Clever ones at that. Harrow must have discovered them, perhaps unwillingly, perhaps through accident. The smugglers likely used his clerical precision to produce flawless copies." He examined several pages. Some forged pages are dated months ago, others mere days. "Watson, these were intended to pass through the docks under the guise of regular shipping." "But why hide them here?" I asked. "Because hiding them elsewhere involved risk. This warehouse was seldom visited. Harrow or his brother was tasked with managing it. But then, something went wrong." He returned the papers to their cavity and replaced the boards. "Two brothers," Holmes murmured, pacing slowly. "One honest, perhaps frightened, the other dabbling in criminal work, or perhaps both unwilling pawns. Richter plays a dangerous game. When one twin tried to escape or threatened exposure, he was killed. The second was then silenced as well." The lantern flickered. For a moment, the shadows on Holmes's face looked almost skeletal. "There is something else," he said suddenly. "Look at the dust near the wall." I followed his gesture. Faint, thin lines crossed the floor, scuff marks barely visible. "Dragging marks," Holmes said. The body was moved, but more intriguingly, the marks vanished near the rear door. I frowned, but the rear door was locked. "Locked now," Holmes corrected, "not necessarily at the time." He approached it and examined the lock closely. After a moment, he smiled. "A scratch, very faint, recently made. Someone entered or departed through here using a key not quite suited to the lock." He stood back. "Watson, we are close. Richter was here, no more than a day or two before the murder. He retrieved something, or left something behind." I felt a prickle at the nape of my neck, as though the warehouse itself were listening. Holmes turned toward the main door. "We must revisit Harrow's lodgings, this time with greater scrutiny. A man who hides receipts hides other things as well, and we must determine which brother truly lived there." Just then, footsteps echoed faintly outside the warehouse, light, quick, and unmistakably cautious. Holmes extinguished the lantern at once. We stood motionless in the warehouse's gloom, the faint seep of fog through the loose boards chilling the air further. The footsteps outside grew sharper, first one pair, then another. A low murmur followed, the indistinct conversation of men who wished not to be overheard. Holmes lifted a hand gently, signaling silence. Even in the darkness, I could sense the sharp alertness radiating from him. The hinges of the warehouse door twitched. A pause, then a quiet attempt at turning the handle. Holmes leaned close and whispered, "Stay behind the crates by the wall. If trouble comes, strike low and decisively." I obeyed at once, crouching behind a tall stack of empty shipping crates. Holmes pressed himself against the stone support column near the door, invisible except for the faint gleam of his eyes. The door creaked open a mere inch, just enough for a shadow to slip through. Another followed. Their lantern was shuttered, but a thin strip of light escaped, cutting across the dust like a blade. The intruders moved slowly, as if expecting the place to be deserted, but unwilling to fully trust the assumption. Then came a whisper. "Check the boards." He said it'd be under the third row. A second voice replied, low and rasping. "I don't like this. That detective's been sniffing around." Holmes's glance flashed toward me, a signal to remain still. The two men advanced toward the very place Holmes had uncovered moments ago. One knelt and pressed his hand against the loose boards. "It's here," he said. Then louder, "Bring the crow." Before the second man could move, a sharp thud sounded. Holmes had seized him from behind, striking with precision. The man crumpled silently. The kneeling intruder spun around, reaching inside his coat, but before he could draw whatever weapon he sought, I stepped from behind the crates, propelled by instinct as much as courage. "Stop at once," I barked. Startled, he fumbled, hesitating long enough for Holmes to close the distance and wrench his arm behind him. The lantern clattered to the floor, its shutter springing open to reveal the pale, startled face of a young dock labourer. Holmes shoved him against a crate. "Your name." The man clenched his jaw. "You've no authority." Holmes tightened his grip with such speed that the fellow winced. "I assure you, I have all the authority required. Your name?" "Alec Brewster," he muttered. "And your companion?" "Tom Vickers." The unconscious man groaned faintly. Holmes inspected Brewster's coat, retrieving a narrow metal crowbar, a folded note, and a key, one clearly filed down at the edges. Holmes held up the key. "This does not belong to the warehouse. Who gave it to you?" Brewster's bravado faltered. His eyes darted to the hidden cavity beneath the floorboards. "I won't say." Holmes leaned very slightly closer. "Then you will be charged with attempted burglary, interference with a police investigation, and likely complicity in murder. Speak now, and you may yet see daylight again." Brewster broke almost instantly. "It was Richter," he said hoarsely. "He told us to fetch the papers, said someone was poking about, said we had to move them somewhere safer." "And where is Richter now?" Brewster shook his head. "Don't know. He changes places every night, sends messages, doesn't show his face." Holmes skimmed the folded note he had taken. I could see from his expression he found what he expected. "A meeting place," he said. "Tonight, 9 o'clock, at Limehouse Basin." Brewster blanched. "We weren't going to meet him. We were just supposed to leave anything we found under the dock steps." Holmes nodded slowly, filing the information away. "Watson," he said calmly, "if you would be so kind as to secure Mr. Vickers with this rope." Once both intruders were bound, Holmes dragged them aside and extinguished their lantern. Then he stepped close to me and spoke low. This changes matters. Richter is taking precautions. He suspects the yard, perhaps even my involvement. I whispered, "You intend to go to the meeting?" "Of course, but not as ourselves." He led me out of the warehouse into the cold, fog-draped evening. The river's breath curled around us like a living thing. We walked swiftly, almost silently, until we reached a narrow lane lit by a flickering lamp. Holmes stopped, glancing back to ensure we had not been followed. "Watson," he said, "we must consider our next steps carefully. Richter will not appear unless he feels entirely secure, but he will send someone, and whoever arrives tonight will know of the forgeries, the warehouse, and possibly of the brothers." He paused. "You see, Brewster's confession helps us understand the mechanics, but not the motive." "The motive?" I echoed. Holmes nodded. Why did Richter need two identical men? Why use them to forge customs documents? And why kill them both? A single forged document may slip past inspection, but two bodies complicate matters. Murder is the last resort of the incompetent or the desperate. We continued down the lane until we reached a busier road where cabs rattled by in a steady procession. Holmes flagged one down. "Back to Baker Street." "Should we not return to the boarding house first?" I asked. "In time," Holmes said. "But before any further search, we must understand the true nature of the brothers' involvement. And for that, Watson, I must examine the documents more thoroughly and compare them to the official entries at the customs office." The cab carried us through London's dim veins, past shopfronts shuttering for the evening and lamplighters kindling their faint glows. Holmes remained still, his eyes unfocused yet unblinking. "Two men," he murmured, "one dead by stealth, the other by violence, both drawn into a criminal scheme for reasons we have not yet seen." "And Richter?" I asked. "He lies deeper than any of them, a spider at the center of a web of forged documents, false shipments, and chemical aging." The cab slowed as we neared Baker Street. Holmes stepped out and strode up the steps with unusual urgency. Once inside, he lit the lamps with swift motions and spread the recovered documents across the table. "Watson," he said without looking at me, "observe." I stepped forward. The pages, though yellowed, bore inconsistencies. Some seals were slightly smudged, their stamps uneven. Others were pristine, too pristine. "These were manufactured in stages," Holmes said. "Some by an experienced hand, others by a novice, a man learning the craft. That novice, I suspect, was Edwin Harrow, or his brother." He lifted two nearly identical documents side by side. "Look here. This seal bears a minuscule blemish, a flaw unique to a particular stamp. Yet on this second forged document, the blemish is absent." "That seems impossible," I said. "It would be, if made by the same man." He looked up sharply, his eyes ablaze with sudden clarity. "Watson, I believe the brothers did not work together. One forged documents for Richter willingly. The other tried to expose the operation. Their identities became entangled, fatally so." A heavy silence fell. Holmes stood, his expression grave. "We go to Limehouse tonight. There we may find the truth, or the man who murdered both Harrows." Outside, the lamps guttered in the wind. Inside, Holmes's certainty hung in the room like a storm about to break. Night had already settled over London when we left Baker Street once more, heavy, breathless and thick with the kind of fog that swallowed lantern light whole. Limehouse, with its crooked alleys and silent wharves, had always possessed an eerie quality after dark, but that evening it felt especially ominous. Holmes walked swiftly, his coat drawn close, his features hard with the resolve of a man who expected danger at every turn. "Watson," he murmured as we neared the basin, "keep your revolver easily accessible. Richter's men are cornered animals tonight, and cornered animals often bite." I nodded, patting the inside of my coat. My revolver rested there, cold, reassuring, and significantly less comforting than Holmes seemed to imagine. Limehouse basins appeared suddenly out of the fog, as though carved from the darkness. The water lay black and still, broken only by the faint lap against moored barges. Empty crates, ropes, and rusted metal hooks lay scattered along the docksides, silent relics of the day's labor. A single lamp flickered near the old harbor steps, its weak flame bowing in the wind. Holmes stopped and surveyed the scene. "This is the place mentioned in Brewster's note. The men were to leave their recovered documents under the dock steps. Richter, or one of his trusted agents, would collect them." He gestured toward a stack of crates beside the stone steps. "We shall wait there." We settled behind the crates, crouching low. The night pressed in around us. A damp chill clung to my back, seeping even through the thick wool of my coat. Holmes, however, seemed as rigid and immovable as a statue, his attention fixed forward, every sense sharpened and coiled for action. For several minutes, nothing stirred except the fog. My eyes strained against the darkness until they ached. Then, soft, faint, almost imagined, a footstep. Holmes raised a finger. Another footstep followed, then the quiet scuff of a boot against stone. A shape materialized from the fog, a man tall and thin, with a long coat whose collar was turned up almost to his ears. He paused near the harbor steps, listening, glancing about with the nervousness of one accustomed to danger. Holmes leaned close to my ear. Not Richter, too slight, but a trusted courier, no doubt. The man crouched at the bottom step and reached beneath it with a gloved hand. His fingers fumbled about the cavity where Brewster's retrieved papers should have been. Holmes moved like lightning. He sprang forward, seizing the man's collar and yanking him up with such force that the fellow cried out. I followed quickly, revolver drawn. "Name," Holmes said sharply. The man struggled, attempting to wrench free. "Let go of me. I've done nothing." Holmes twisted his arm with practiced precision. "Your name?" "Alfred Greeley," he gasped. Holmes eyed him coldly. "And your business here tonight?" Greeley hesitated. A fatal mistake. Holmes tightened his grip again. All right. Richter sent me, only to fetch what the others left," Greeley blurted. Holmes nodded, confirming his suspicion. "And where is Richter?" Greeley swallowed. "I don't know, truly. He never meets anyone directly, sends messages, gives instructions, pays well, that's all." Holmes narrowed his eyes. "You lie, but you lie poorly. You know more, perhaps not where he resides, but where he hides." The man's voice trembled. "I swear, I don't—" Holmes suddenly froze. Footsteps, more than one, approaching rapidly from the narrow lane behind the dock. "Down!" Holmes hissed. He shoved Greeley to the ground and pulled me behind a wooden winch. Two figures burst through the fog, broad-shouldered, purposeful, and armed. Their silhouettes moved like predators closing in. Holmes crouched low, whispering, "These men are no dock workers. The newcomers advanced toward the exact place where Greeley had been minutes earlier. One muttered, "He should have been here already." The other grunted, "If he's late, something's wrong. Check the steps." Before they reached the stone stair, Greeley foolishly attempted to crawl away. His shoes scraped the ground. Both men snapped toward the sound. "There!" one shouted. Holmes stood instantly. "Run, Watson!" Gunfire split the night as we bolted from cover. A bullet clanged against the metal of the winch behind us. Another struck a crate, splintering wood. Holmes seized my arm and pulled me behind a barge mooring post. Greeley scrambled blindly toward the water until Holmes snagged him by the collar and dragged him back just in time. The armed men advanced rapidly, sweeping the dock with their revolvers raised. "Holmes," I whispered harshly. "We're trapped." "Not trapped," Holmes answered. "Funneled. There is a difference." He scanned the nearby structures, then spotted a narrow wooden shed near the pier. Its door hung crookedly, its sideboards warped by damp. "This way." We sprinted, Greeley stumbling between us. Bullets whistled past, one ricocheting off the stone steps with a violent spark. Holmes shoved open the shed door, and we tumbled inside. Darkness swallowed us. Holmes pulled the door nearly shut, leaving only a sliver to watch the men approach. They searched cautiously, their lanterns sweeping across the docks in wide arcs. Holmes breathed barely above a whisper. "Observe their coordination, their weapons. These are Richter's closest men. Greeley, if they find you, they will not hesitate to ensure your silence is permanent." Greeley whimpered softly. The men paused near the shed. One said, "He went this way." They began advancing. My hand gripped the revolver so tightly it trembled. Holmes touched my wrist lightly, an indication to hold steady. Then, voices broke out behind the gunman. A second group of men approached from the lane. These carried the crisp voices of authority, not the hushed tones of criminals. "Police, stand where you are." It was Lestrade, and half a dozen yard officers with him. Holmes exhaled soundlessly, though his eyes remained watchful. The gunman fired once before attempting to flee, but the yard officers had already surrounded them. Within moments, both were disarmed and restrained. Holmes stepped out of the shed calmly, dusting his coat. Lestrade stared in astonishment. "Holmes, what in heaven's name?" "No time," Holmes cut in. "We have one of Richter's couriers." He hauled Greeley forward. "And we are close, very close, to understanding how the Harrow case fits into Richter's operations." Lestrade seized Greeley by the shoulder. "You'll be answering for quite a bit, my friend." Holmes turned sharply toward me. "Watson, come. The night's business is far from over. This man can give us a thread, thin but enough, to lead us to Richter himself. And once we have Richter, we shall unravel the entire knot." "But Holmes," I said, "where are we going?" "To the yard," he replied. "We must question Greeley while the memory of fear sharpens his honesty." He paused and added in a lower voice, "And afterward, we shall return to Harrow's lodgings. There is something there, something small, easily overlooked, that must explain why one twin died quietly and the other violently." He turned, coat swirling behind him like a shadow. "The truth is close, Watson. I can feel it. But the final piece remains concealed, and we must uncover it before Richter decides to silence the last witness who understands the difference between the two Harrows." We arrived at Scotland Yard with Greeley in tow, shivering and pale beneath the inspector's relentless grip. The corridors were quieter by night, illuminated sparsely by gas jets that hissed softly, casting wavering shadows on the lime-washed walls. Lestrade led us down a narrow stairway to an interrogation room, bare except for a wooden table, 2 chairs, and a thick ledger placed deliberately near the edge. Holmes motioned for Greeley to sit. The man sank into the chair as though his knees could no longer support him. Lestrade stood behind him with folded arms, a looming presence that required no explanation. Holmes sat opposite Greeley and studied him for a long moment, his eyes calm but piercing. "You understand your situation," Holmes began softly. "Your companions at the docks will face heavy charges. You, however, may yet avoid a similar fate, if you speak honestly." Greeley's voice trembled. I'll say what I can." Holmes clasped his hands. "What is Richter's operation?" Greeley breathed rapidly, his gaze shifting between Holmes and Lestrade. "He controls forged customs papers, ship manifests, licenses, everything needed to disguise illegal goods as legitimate cargo. Some of the goods come in from the continent. Most are harmless enough. Textiles, spirits, machinery without tax stamps. But a few, opium, weapons. He'll forge papers for anything, if the price is right." Holmes nodded slowly. "And Edwin Harrow?" Greeley swallowed. Richter needed someone who could copy the style of legitimate clerks, down to the dotted I and the flourish on official seals. Harrow's work at Wilkes and Trent made him perfect, but he wasn't keen on it at first. Richter sent messages, promises, threats. Then Harrow agreed. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Which Harrow?" Greeley blinked. "What?" Holmes leaned forward. "There were 2 men, identical in appearance, twins. Which one forged the documents?" Understanding dawned on Greeley's face. "Oh, you know." Holmes said nothing. Greeley hesitated. Then, "The one who worked for Richter had a slight limp, only noticeable sometimes. Richter said it came from an old injury, but they both looked alike, uncannily so." Holmes exchanged a glance with me. That detail, small as it was, carried enormous weight. Lestrade stepped forward. "So, one brother was a criminal?" Greeley nodded. "Yes, the limping one. But the other, Edwin, if that was his name, he wasn't part of it. Richter said he was the quiet one, the useless one, the one who'd ruin everything if he talked." Holmes's voice sharpened. "And is that why he was killed?" Greeley hesitated. "Richter ordered it, said the honest brother suspected something and had to be removed. After the murder, the other brother, Richter's forger, panicked. He wanted out. He said the yard was too close, that he'd be found. So Richter arranged another meeting in the warehouse. The forger went and didn't come back." Holmes's lips formed a thin line. Thus, both twins died within 2 days. One executed quietly to silence suspicion, the other murdered by the associates he had tried to abandon. Lestrade exhaled sharply. A devilish web. Holmes turned again to Greeley. "Who carried out the killings?" "The first one, at the boarding house, was done by a man named Rafe Miller. Posed as a visitor. Slipped something into the basin water that stopped Harrow's heart in the night. I felt a chill course through me. The residue Holmes had discovered in the washstand's basin, the faint ring of some unknown agent, was no residue of soap at all. And the second killing." Holmes pressed. Greeley answered without looking up. That was Richter's right-hand man, a brute called Thorne. Killed the forger in the warehouse when he demanded to leave. Holmes stilled. Thorne. Yes. That aligns with the footprints and the drag marks. Richter ordered both, Greeley added. Said one lived too quietly, the other too recklessly. Couldn't risk it. Holmes rose slowly. You have been remarkably forthcoming. Greeley trembled. I don't want to die. Richter kills anyone who crosses him. He'll come for me if he knows I've talked. You need not fear Richter now, Holmes said. We will soon have him. Lestrade moved to escort Greeley away when Holmes suddenly lifted a hand. One more question, Holmes said quietly. Where is Richter hiding tonight? Greeley shook his head. He moves constantly, never the same place twice. But there is somewhere he goes to meet his closest men. A safe room. Holmes's expression sharpened. Where? A storage loft above the old rope works near Narrow Street. It overlooks the water. Holmes nodded once. That will suffice. Lestrade motioned for an officer to remove Greeley, then turned to Holmes. Do you trust him? As far as any man speaks truth when cornered by fear, Holmes replied, but not far enough to rely on his memory alone. We shall verify his claims at once. He took his coat. Watson, Lestrade, come. We left Scotland Yard and stepped again into the night's fog. The gas lamps burned dimly along the street, their lights struggling to reach the ground. Holmes walked swiftly, his mind plainly turning over every word Greeley had spoken. At last, I asked, Holmes, do you truly believe we shall find Richter at the rope works? Holmes's gaze remained forward. No, Richter will not expose himself, but Thorne may, and where Thorne stands guard, Richter stands very close. We secured a cab and headed toward Limehouse again, though by a longer route than before. The cabman eyed us curiously, wondering no doubt why three men in respectable coats would choose to travel into the most disreputable corner of the riverfront at such an hour. When we arrived, the rope works loomed ahead, an enormous timbered building with blackened windows, its roof sagging with age. Thick coils of rope were heaped on the ground outside like petrified serpents. No light showed from the loft above. Lestrade whispered, Do you think they're inside? Holmes motioned for silence and crouched behind a row of crates. The fog had thinned slightly, revealing faint moonlight on the river beyond. Observe the upper window, Holmes murmured. A shadow moved. Not drifted, but moved. We watched, barely breathing. Minutes passed. Then a new sound, soft footsteps on wood, echoed from above. Holmes's hand tightened on his cane. Thorne. Lestrade gripped his revolver. Shall we rush them? No, Holmes said quietly. Thorne is dangerous. Better to draw him out. He stepped forward, placing himself where moonlight could frame his silhouette. The reaction was immediate. A harsh voice barked from the loft. Who goes there? Holmes answered calmly. A man who seeks Samuel Richter. A moment of silence followed, as though the night held its breath. Then something shifted in the loft, swift, heavy, deliberate. Holmes turned sharply. Down, Watson! A shot boomed from above, splintering the crate beside us. Lestrade shouted to his men, Circle the building! Don't let him escape! Holmes rose, eyes blazing with purpose. Thorne is cornered, he said, and a cornered man will reveal more in desperation than he would in any interrogation. I clutched my revolver and followed as Holmes advanced toward the stairs. The fog wrapped us like a shroud, but the truth was finally burning its way through the darkness. And Holmes, calm, relentless Holmes, was ready to seize it. The staircase leading to the loft was steep, narrow, and maliciously creaky. Each step moaned under our weight, betraying us with a long wooden groan that echoed through the cavernous ropeworks. Holmes ascended first, silent as a shadow despite the treacherous boards beneath him. I followed close behind, revolver in hand, while Lestrade and 2 constables advanced along the far wall, seeking a second approach to cut off any escape. Halfway up, Holmes paused, his hand lifted sharply. Halt! We froze. Above us, in the darkness of the loft, something shifted. A footstep. Heavy, slow, deliberate. Holmes whispered, "He is waiting for us." The silence stiffened the air. Thorne's voice rang out suddenly, deep, harsh, and filled with contempt. "I know that voice. Sherlock Holmes, you've come far enough. One more step, and the Yard will be collecting your corpse on a stretcher." Holmes's reply was cool as stone. "You have already killed 2 men, Thorne. I do not believe you wish to add a third tonight." A cruel laugh rolled from above. "Believe what you like. Richter said you were clever, but cleverness won't save you." Holmes resumed his ascent, slow and measured, though each movement seemed to tighten the tension in the air. "Thorne," he said, "you are cornered. The ropeworks is surrounded. Escape is impossible." Another laugh, short, sharp, ugly. "Nothing's impossible for me." Then, a sudden burst of motion, the sound of a heavy object being dragged, the groan of wood, a rope tightening. Holmes's eyes flashed upward. "Back!" But before we could retreat, Thorne hurled something from the loft. It slammed into the stairs below us, a crate, heavy and packed, smashing the railing into splinters. I clung to the wall as debris clattered and tumbled into the shadows below. Lestrade shouted from across the room, "Holmes, are you hit?" Holmes did not answer immediately. When he spoke, his voice was breathless but unshaken. Merely startled. "Keep your officers in position." We reached the top of the stairs, the loft stretching before us in a maze of shadows. Thick coils of hemp rope lay stacked in piles, absorbing light, giving the impression of crouched beasts in the half-dark. A narrow walkway of planks crossed the loft like a bent spine. Somewhere ahead, hidden behind the coils, lurked Thorne. Holmes motioned for silence and slipped behind a stack of rope. I followed. The air smelled of dust, tar, and old fibers. Every breath tasted stale. Holmes leaned close. "Watson, stay low. He is armed, but his ammunition must be limited." A faint scuffling noise sounded to our right. Holmes's head snapped toward it. Then a flash of movement. A hulking shape darted behind a pillar. Holmes surged forward. "Thorne, it is over. Tell me where Richter is." Thorne answered with a gunshot. The report thundered in the narrow loft. A splinter of plank whizzed past my ear. Holmes ducked behind a beam, voice rising with icy authority. "You are alone, Thorne. There is nowhere to run." "You don't know a thing," Thorne snarled. "Richter's gone. Long gone. And when I'm finished with you, he'll be the last man standing." Holmes moved again, swift and silent, flanking the pillar where Thorne had taken cover. I mirrored him on the opposite side, creeping low, feeling the tremor of each heartbeat in my palm. For a moment, we heard only Thorne's ragged breathing. Holmes spoke once more, calm, precise. relentless. Harrow, the twin who worked for Richter, you murdered him. And the other brother, the innocent one, you killed in his sleep. You did Richter's bidding without hesitation. He will not reward such loyalty. Silence. Then Thorne's voice, shuddering with fury. That little rat betrayed us. Richter gave him everything: money, work, protection. And he wanted out. Out. Like he was too good for us. 2 lives ended, Holmes said quietly, because Richter's empire could not withstand a single frightened man. A plank creaked. Holmes tensed. Thorne lunged from the shadows with a roar, firing wildly. Holmes dodged, the bullet grazing the sleeve of his coat. I fired instinctively, my shot splintering the wooden post beside Thorne's shoulder. The brute charged toward Holmes with a strength that seemed almost inhuman, but Holmes sidestepped with a grace born of years of fencing and boxing. Thorne crashed into a stack of coiled rope, stumbling. Before he could regain his footing, Holmes was upon him, grappling, twisting, wrenching the gun from his hand. They struggled in the tight space, the planks groaning beneath their weight. Thorne snarled like a cornered animal, seizing Holmes by the throat. I rushed forward, but Holmes raised one hand sharply, signaling me to hold. Then, with a sudden, powerful motion, Holmes shifted his weight, turning Thorne's grip against him. He forced the brute backward, toward a sagging section of floor that creaked ominously. Thorne lunged again. Holmes pivoted, using Thorne's momentum to throw him off balance. The corrupted plank gave way. With a shout, Thorne plunged through the rotted wood, crashing onto the floor below. Lestrade's officers surrounded him instantly, revolvers aimed. Thorne lay winded, clutching at his ribs, the fight finally beaten out of him. Holmes descended the steps with measured calm. Lestrade exhaled in relief. "Well, I'll be damned, Holmes. You've done it." Holmes shook his head. "No, Lestrade. We have caught the brute, but not the mind that commands him. Thorne has answers we require." The inspector nodded grimly. "We'll have him before the magistrate tonight, and he will talk." But Holmes's gaze had already drifted beyond the captured man, beyond the rope works itself. "Richter," he murmured. "He is already on the move." Holmes turned to me. "Watson, we must return to Harrow's lodgings now. The final piece of this puzzle lies not with Thorne, nor with the warehouse, but in that quiet room where Edwin Harrow died." A shudder passed through me. Holmes's voice, though low, carried the certainty of revelation. "There is a clue, small, almost invisible, that we missed. Once we uncover it, the entire truth will stand before us." He stepped into the night, his coat whispering behind him like a dark banner. "Come, Watson. The dead are ready to speak." We reached Islington shortly past midnight, the fog now thick enough to turn every lamp into a trembling halo. The boarding house stood as it had before, modest, quiet, and unthreatening. Yet Holmes moved toward it with the wary intensity of a man approaching a crime scene for the first time, not the second. Mrs. Penbury answered our knock almost at once, her face pale beneath the lamplight. "Oh, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I had not expected—" "Forgive the hour," Holmes said gently, "but we must examine Mr. Harrow's room once more. It is a matter of utmost importance." She nodded apprehensively and led us upstairs. The narrow corridors seemed even more claustrophobic at night. The walls pressed inward, the stale smell of cabbage lingering faintly. Holmes entered the room without hesitation, motioning for me to shut the door behind us. Though I had seen it only 2 nights earlier, something about the room felt different. No less tidy, no less still, but charged now with the awareness that it had hosted not a natural death, but a carefully staged murder. Holmes crossed to the washstand, where he had found the first trace of the chemical agent. He lifted the jug, examined its rim again, then set it down. "The poison was dissolved here," he murmured, "delivered as harmless water. A simple, silent method. But there is more." He moved next to the writing desk, opening each drawer and examining its contents anew. The pen, the bottle of ink, the blank paper. He held the ink bottle to the light and tilted it slowly. "Odd," he murmured. "What is odd?" I asked. Holmes replaced the bottle. "Nothing yet, but there is a detail that refuses to align with the others." He stepped back, eyes sweeping the room with an almost predatory sharpness. He paced twice, paused, then abruptly crossed to the narrow wardrobe in the corner. Opening it, he inspected the few hanging garments, plain shirts, a coat, trousers folded neatly on a lower shelf. "Watson," he said suddenly, "look closely at these." I stepped forward. The garments were unremarkable, yet Holmes pointed to the hem of the coat. A fray, very slight. "From where?" I suggested. Holmes shook his head. "From tampering." He ran his fingers along the inside lining until he found a tiny slit. With precise care, he withdrew a small scrap of paper, folded tightly, nearly invisible in the dark cloth. "Ah," he whispered, "I knew it." He unfolded the scrap and held it to the lamplight. It was a note, written in hurried, unsteady script. "Meet at the warehouse, midnight. Bring the real papers. Do not fail. S." I felt the hairs on my neck rise. "Richter, or his agent," Holmes said. "It matters not. What matters is this. The note was written for Edwin Harrow. Edwin, not the limping brother." He tapped the paper with a fingertip. "This is the key. Edwin, innocent Edwin, was summoned to the warehouse. But he did not go. He hid the note. He feared something. Perhaps he suspected danger." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "And so Richter sent someone to silence him before he could speak." I exhaled slowly. "Then the forger brother went in his stead and paid for it." Holmes nodded. "Precisely. But there is more yet." He turned abruptly to the bedside table and lifted the small oil lamp upon it. Removing its glass chimney, he inspected the metal base. With the tip of his penknife, he scraped at a nearly invisible smudge. The residue came away faintly yellow. "Phosphorus compound," Holmes murmured. "Part of the chemical mixture used to age paper. Why is it here? Harrow did not work with such substances. Unless..." He paused, then looked up sharply. "Watson, consider the sequence. Edwin hid the note. Edwin feared being drawn into the crime. But the real papers, mentioned in this note, what were they?" "The genuine customs documents," I said. "Those needed to expose the forgeries." Holmes's face lit with triumph. "At last. Yes. Edwin Harrow found the truth, found the genuine manifests the smugglers had copied. He meant to give them to the authorities. That is why he hid the note. That is why he was killed quietly before he could leave." He paced the room with renewed purpose. But he must have hidden the real papers somewhere. Somewhere close, somewhere safe, somewhere that would incriminate Richter beyond denial. He stopped abruptly and turned to the bed. "The mattress," he whispered. I watched in amazement as Holmes lifted the mattress and felt along its edges. After a moment, his fingers struck something firm, something not part of the bedding. With swift efficiency, he slit the fabric open. Inside lay a bundle of documents, official manifests, stamped and sealed, each one matching a counterfeit found in the warehouse. Holmes's eyes gleamed. The final proof. Edwin hid them here. The forgeries cannot withstand comparison with the originals. I leaned closer. He must have known his life was in danger. Holmes's voice softened. Yes, the poor fellow tried to escape his fate, but Richter moved more quickly. At that moment, hurried footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. Lestrade burst into the room, hat askew, cheeks flushed. Holmes, we've caught Thorne's associates attempting to flee Limehouse. And more, we found a ledger among their things. Names, payments, Richter's coded accounts. Holmes tucked the bundle of real manifests into his coat. Then the noose tightens. Lestrade glanced around the room. You found something. The last missing piece, Holmes replied. The motive for Edwin Harrow's murder, and the evidence that will destroy Richter's entire operation. Lestrade blinked. Where is Richter now? Holmes's expression hardened. Running, hiding, but not for long. He took one last look around the room, as though bidding silent farewell to the man whose quiet life had ended in unspeakable confusion. Then he turned to us, his voice steady and resolute. We go back to the warehouse. Before dawn, Richter will attempt to reclaim the real manifests. They are his last hope and his final mistake. He stepped into the hallway. Come, Watson. Lestrade. The trap is nearly complete. The fog had thickened into a rolling, heavy blanket as we stepped back into the street. The gas lamps little more than faint blurs drifting in the grey. Holmes walked with swift, determined strides, the bundle of original manifests secured beneath his coat. Beside him, Lestrade struggled to match his pace, puffing faintly as we made our way toward the waiting cab. Holmes, I said as we climbed inside, do you truly believe Richter will return to the warehouse tonight? Holmes settled back, fingers steepled beneath his chin. Without question, Richter is a man of calculation, not panic. The real manifests we now carry, those were his greatest vulnerability. He will not abandon them. At this moment, he does not know whether the honest twins succeeded in hiding them or whether the documents were discovered by Thorne before the Yard intervened. Lestrade nodded grimly. So, he'll attempt to retrieve them himself. Or he will send the one man left he trusts, Holmes replied. But whether he comes in person or by proxy, he will come. That warehouse is the fulcrum of his entire enterprise. The cab rattled through the sleeping streets until the river's scent seeped once more into the night air. Shadwell loomed ahead, murky and silent, save for the distant lap of the tide. The warehouse sat as we had left it, dark, ominous, its outline blurred by fog. Lestrade motioned to two constables lurking in a nearby alley. Keep your men hidden, Holmes whispered. If Richter suspects an ambush, he will vanish like smoke. We entered the warehouse quietly, Holmes closing the heavy door behind us. The interior was black as pitch. Only when the constables had taken their positions along the back wall did Holmes allow the faint lighting of a single lantern, which he set upon a crate. The pale flame illuminated the dusty boards where the body had once lain. The air smelled of cold wood and river damp. Holmes surveyed the space with practiced surgical precision. "Watson," he said softly, "stand behind those crates along the left wall, there where the shadows thicken. Lestrade, take position behind the pillar. I shall wait here." "And Richter?" I asked. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Richter will announce himself only by necessity. He is a creature of silence." We waited. Minutes trickled past, the kind of slow passage that stretches the nerves to their tightest limits. The lantern flickered once, then steadied. Outside, the fog curled against the boards like a restless animal. Then, at last, a sound. Not footsteps, but the faint metallic click of a lock. Holmes raised a hand. Another click, soft, precise. The rear door of the warehouse eased open by no more than a finger's width. A narrow beam of outside fog slipped inside. A silhouette entered, tall, thin, confident. The man closed the door behind him without a sound. Richter. He moved like a creature born to darkness, gliding rather than walking. His coat fell in straight, severe lines, his hat brim angled low, concealing all but the sharp contour of his jaw. He walked directly toward the loose floorboards, where the forged manifests had been hidden. Holmes stepped forward, his voice cool and crisp. "Good evening, Mr. Richter." The figure froze. A long silence fell, so thick it seemed to muffle even the lantern's flame. When Richter finally turned, the movement was slow, measured, and calm. "I had wondered," he said, his voice smooth as polished steel, "how long it would take Sherlock Holmes to involve himself in matters that did not concern him." Holmes smiled faintly. "On the contrary, matters of murder and forgery concern me greatly. 2 men are dead because of your schemes." Richter's gaze hardened. "2 useless creatures. They endangered everything I built." Holmes stepped forward. "You built nothing but a house of lies, and it is collapsing even as we speak." Richter's hand drifted toward his coat. Lestrade rose from behind the pillar, revolver leveled. "I wouldn't," he warned. Richter's lip curled slightly. "Ah, Scotland Yard, always playing at competence." Holmes nodded toward the loosened floorboards. "You came for the real manifests, but they are no longer here." Richter's eyes flashed. "Then you have them." Holmes withdrew the bundle from his coat and held it lightly in one hand. "Indeed." For the first time, Richter's composure wavered. "Give them to me." Holmes shook his head. "These documents prove every crime committed under your direction. The false shipments, the illegal cargo, the forged customs papers. When placed side by side with the forgeries, your entire operation will unravel." Richter breathed sharply. "You do not understand what you are doing, Holmes." "Oh, but I do," Holmes replied softly. "I am removing the keystone from the arch. Without these papers, your empire does not simply crumble, it becomes undeniable." Richter took one step forward, then another. His eyes had become the cold, predatory eyes of a man cornered yet desperate enough to attack. Holmes raised his hand. "Another step, Richter, and Lestrade fires." Richter glanced toward the shadows, calculating the number of officers. Then he moved. Swift as lightning, he lunged, not at Holmes, but toward a rope suspended from the high beam above. He seized it, swung hard across the open space, and kicked the lantern from its crate. The flame toppled, sputtering, but did not extinguish. Chaos erupted. Lestrade fired, missing by inches as Richter let go of the rope and vaulted behind a stack of crates. A constable shouted. Another rushed forward. Holmes dashed toward the fallen lantern, stomping the flame back into its base before it could spread. I sprinted toward the crates, revolver raised. Richter darted between shadows, moving with uncanny speed and agility, seeking the rear door. He rammed it open, slipping into the fog beyond. "After him!" Lestrade cried. Holmes was already in motion. We burst outside into the fog, the river's damp air slapping against our faces. Richter's silhouette flashed ahead, gliding toward the narrow footpath along the water's edge. Lestrade shouted for the constables to flank him, but the fog swallowed his command. Holmes pursued Richter with astonishing speed. I followed, my lungs burning. Richter reached the footpath, a narrow ledge between the warehouse and the black water of the Thames. He ran along it, his boots clattering on the slick stones. Holmes closed in. "Richter!" he shouted. "It is over!" Richter did not slow. Instead, he veered sharply toward a moored skiff tied to a rotting post. Holmes lunged and caught him by the coat. The two men grappled violently, Richter twisting with manic strength. The skiff rocked against the pier. The fog swirled around them in ghostly spirals. Richter's hand shot to his belt. A knife flashed. "Holmes!" I shouted. Holmes wrenched backward just as the blade swept through the air. Richter slashed again, wild, ruthless, desperate. Holmes seized his wrist, twisting hard. The knife clattered to the stones. Richter stumbled and slipped. His foot missed the edge of the path. He toppled backward, arms flailing, and plunged into the river with a splash that echoed across the fog-draped basin. Lestrade arrived at last, panting. "Holmes! Where is he?" Holmes stared into the black water. Ripples spread outward, but nothing surfaced. "He won't come up," Lestrade muttered. Holmes shook his head. "He may, or he may let the river swallow him. But whether he drowns tonight or stands before a magistrate tomorrow, his crimes are ended." He turned to me, his face drawn but composed. "Watson, the Harrow brothers may finally rest." Then, with a tired sigh, he added, "And so, perhaps, may we, once the yard has gathered what remains to be found." The fog closed around us, heavy and silent, as Richter's ripples faded into stillness. The river swallowed the last trace of Richter without so much as a bubble, and for a long moment, none of us spoke. The fog drifted slowly across the dark water, hiding whatever fate had claimed him. At last, Lestrade signaled to his constables. "Search the bank," he ordered. "If the man surfaces, we seize him. If not, mark the spot." Two officers moved off into the mist, lanterns held low. Their light skimmed across the waves, pale and futile. Holmes stood beside me, his gaze fixed upon the blackness below. The lantern reflected faintly in his eyes, giving them a curious gleam, one part triumph, one part regret. "Holmes," I said quietly, "you could not have foreseen the river." Holmes's shoulders rose and fell in a slow breath. "Perhaps not, but the outcome is fitting." Richter lived in shadows, slipping unseen through the crevices of the city. It is no surprise that he would vanish into the darkest of them. Lestrade approached, rubbing his gloved hands together for warmth. "Holmes, drowned or not, the evidence you've recovered is enough to crush the whole gang. Thorne will crumble in a day, and Brewster and Vickers will sing a full confession if it means avoiding the gallows." Holmes nodded. Richter left too many threads dangling. Greed often leads a criminal to recklessness. But it was fear of being unmasked, that forced his final misstep. A gust of wind shifted the fog. The faint outline of the warehouse loomed behind us, like some sleeping beast. Holmes turned from the water. "We must return inside. There is something left undone." I followed him into the warehouse once more, Lestrade close behind. The lantern Holmes had restored earlier still glowed on the crate, though its flame had dwindled to a thin, wavering line. Shadows sprawled across the floor like pools of ink. "Holmes," Lestrade said, "surely this place holds no more secrets." Holmes walked forward, studying the boards, the walls, the crates, all with that same probing intensity that had solved 100 mysteries before. "On the contrary, Lestrade, one final question remains unanswered." He stopped near the center of the warehouse, the very place where the forged papers had been hidden. Why did Richter kill the forger brother with such haste? "Because he panicked," I suggested. "The twin wanted to leave. Richter feared exposure." Holmes shook his head. "That explains motive, but not method. Why here, in this warehouse? Why not elsewhere, somewhere the body could be disposed of quietly? Richter was cautious, precise. The warehouse is dangerous. Too many entrances, too many eyes along the docks." Lestrade frowned. "What are you implying, Holmes?" Holmes's gaze swept the rafters above. "That Richter didn't trust Thorne to bring the forger willingly. There was a struggle. The forger brother did not come quietly." He knelt by the bloodstain and the disturbed dust. "Look here. The drag marks begin near the back wall, where we found the forged papers hidden. That means the victim came here of his own accord, likely expecting a meeting. He was not ambushed on the street. He walked into his death." Lestrade nodded. "All right, but why is that significant?" Holmes rose slowly, brushing dust from his gloves. "Because it means he still believed he could bargain with Richter. Perhaps he even hoped to exchange the real manifests for his freedom. But he did not know Edwin had already hidden them elsewhere. His bargaining power was an illusion, and Richter, realizing this, had him killed." I felt a chill despite the still air. Then Edwin's courage doomed his brother. Holmes's expression softened, if only by a fraction. Courage often brings unintended consequences, but it also brought the truth into our hands. He turned to Lestrade. "Once we return to the yard, compare each forged manifest with its genuine counterpart. You will find discrepancies in ink, in seal quality, in paper aging, enough to convict every man in Richter's network." Lestrade allowed a rare smile. "Consider it done." Holmes stepped back toward the door. "Then our work here is finished." As we exited the warehouse, the fog lifted slightly, enough to reveal the faint glow of dawn seeping into the sky. The dark veil of night peeled away, revealing the pale beginnings of morning light. The river, once black and impenetrable, now shimmered faintly with ripples of grey. Lestrade's constables regrouped near the mooring posts. "No sign of him, sir," one reported. "If he's down there, he's likely lost." Holmes said nothing. Instead, he stared at the water with a thoughtful expression. Not triumph, not satisfaction, but something quieter, more contemplative. Lestrade clapped his gloves together. "Holmes, I'll have the area watched till midday. If the body surfaces, we'll recover it. If not, well, London won't shed tears for him." Holmes gave a small nod. "Quite." We hailed a cab to return to Baker Street. The driver eyed our haggard faces, but made no comment. Holmes climbed in with the measured movements of a man whose mind remained fully awake even when his body longed for rest. As the cab rattled along the damp cobblestones, I watched Holmes's profile in the dim light. He sat rigid, chin slightly lowered, eyes half closed, but I knew he was not drifting into sleep. He was reconstructing the case from end to beginning, seeking the last threads that required tying. After nearly 10 minutes of silence, he spoke. "Watson, you recall the note hidden in the coat?" "Of course." "A meeting request, midnight at the warehouse. But consider this. The note was addressed to Edwin, yet the forger brother arrived instead. You believe Edwin refused to go?" "Exactly. And when he did not appear, the forger brother sensed something amiss. Perhaps he found the note in Edwin's coat. Perhaps Edwin warned him. Or perhaps he was already aware his brother had uncovered the truth." He looked out the cab window. "In any case, the forger went to the warehouse to salvage what he could, but he did not anticipate Richter's paranoia." I nodded. "Richter feared betrayal and killed swiftly," Holmes said, "then staged the second death to match the first, hoping the Yard would dismiss both as some bureaucratic calamity of misidentification. Yet instead," I said, "they found you." Holmes exhaled softly, not quite a sigh. "They always do." We reached Baker Street just as the first true light of dawn broke across the rooftops. Holmes stepped onto the pavement and stretched his long frame. "Come, Watson. One matter remains, the final arrangement of facts. When next we speak of this, it will be in the drawing room, with Lestrade, the recovered papers, and the entire truth laid bare." I followed him up the stairs, knowing the case was not yet finished. Not until Holmes delivered his full explanation in that steady, commanding voice that had once astonished judges, criminals, and even kings. The Harrow brothers were dead. Richter had been swallowed by the river. Thorne and the others were in chains. But the story, the complete story, had yet to be told. And Holmes, already drawing his pipe from his coat, was preparing to tell it. Late that morning, after Holmes had fortified himself with 2 cups of strong coffee and the silence required for his mind to settle into its usual clarity, Lestrade arrived at Baker Street. He carried under his arm a thick bundle of papers tied with twine and wore an expression halfway between triumph and exhaustion. "Holmes," he said, stepping into our sitting room, "the Yard's been up all night comparing those manifests. Your suspicions were spot on. The forgeries are riddled with inconsistencies. Ink defects, mismatched seal impressions, fibers that don't match the custom stock. Everything you predicted." Holmes gestured toward the table. "Set them down, Lestrade. Watson and I are prepared." Lestrade placed the bundle atop the table and removed his gloves. "Your man Brewster gave a full confession. Vickers followed soon after. Thorne, after a bit of prodding, revealed more than he intended. Richter's network will be rounded up before the day is out." "Excellent," Holmes murmured. "Now let us conclude the matter properly." He sat back in his chair, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. The case had been long, complex, and tragic, yet a stillness settled over him now, as though every piece of the puzzle had fallen into place, and he needed only to articulate what he already understood entirely. Lestrade perched on the edge of the sofa, while I took my customary seat near the hearth. Outside the window, the weak autumn sunlight pushed its way through the fog remnants, illuminating the dust motes drifting lazily in our sitting room. Holmes began. "The deaths of the Harrow brothers form the heart of this affair," he said. "To comprehend it fully, we must view their lives in parallel." He leaned forward, his voice steady. Edwin Harrow was, by all accounts, a quiet, conscientious clerk. He lived modestly, kept few associates, and carried no ambition beyond the steady security provided by his position at Wilkes and Trent. His twin, Ernest, was of a different nature, restless, impressionable, a man easily tempted by promises of wealth and opportunity. Lestrade frowned. So Ernest was the forger? Indeed. Richter found him first, saw in him a face identical to an honest, unassuming clerk in the shipping business, a perfect disguise, if used wisely. Ernest learned quickly, too quickly. He grew proficient at imitating his brother's hand, producing convincing facsimiles of customs papers. He became indispensable to Richter's operation. Holmes rose and began pacing slowly. But the success of Ernest's forgeries created an inevitable danger. The real Edwin eventually noticed irregularities in the documents crossing his own desk. Edwin was methodical. He saw that certain manifests, bearing what appeared to be his own handwriting, had never passed through his hands. He investigated quietly and discovered the truth. Holmes stopped by the window. Edwin found the genuine customs manifests tampered with, or rather, substituted. The forged documents were set to be used for incoming shipments of contraband. Realizing the enormity of what he had stumbled upon, Edwin acted with remarkable courage. He stole the genuine manifests before they could be destroyed, meaning to deliver them to the authorities. Lestrade shook his head. A brave man, but not a careful one, Holmes said gently. Richter discovered Edwin's sudden movements. Whether Edwin confided in his brother, or whether Ernest stumbled upon Edwin's fear, we cannot know, but the result was the note you found hidden in Edwin's coat. Holmes picked up the folded scrap from the table and held it between two fingers. The note summoned Edwin to the warehouse at midnight. It was a trap, one set by Richter to determine how much was known and to recover the genuine manifests. He paced again. But Edwin did not go. He suspected danger. Perhaps he meant to flee. Perhaps he hesitated. Regardless, he hid the note, and later hid the manifests in his mattress. That act doomed him. Lestrade leaned forward. The poison. Precisely. Richter could not allow Edwin to remain alive. Rafe Miller, one of Richter's men, disguised himself as a caller, gained entry to the boarding house, and delivered a dose of a phosphorus-based compound into the wash basin water. Edwin died quietly in his sleep, the death appearing natural. A perfect crime, or so Richter believed. Holmes paused, but there remained a loose end. Ernest. When Edwin failed to appear at the warehouse, Ernest realized something was wrong. Either he found the note, or merely sensed betrayal. In desperation, he went to the warehouse, hoping to bargain with Richter, likely offering to retrieve the real manifests in exchange for his safety. Holmes's tone darkened. But Ernest had no bargaining power. He did not know where Edwin had hidden the documents. Richter, ever paranoid, suspected Ernest of treachery. Thorne, his enforcer, killed Ernest during a confrontation. The body was dumped unceremoniously, staged to confuse the yard. Two identical corpses found in two different locations. Richter hoped for chaos, for dismissal, for misidentification. Lestrade snorted. And instead, he got you. Holmes allowed himself a faint smile. A fortunate inconvenience for him. He lifted one of the forged manifests from the bundle. The forged papers were intended to legitimate vast quantities of contraband, including weapons and opium, flowing through London's docks. With both twins dead, Richter attempted a desperate salvage effort, retrieving the forged documents from the warehouse and replacing them with the genuine ones. But Edwin had hidden the originals too well, and Ernest, the only man who could reveal their location, was gone. Holmes set the paper down. And so Richter himself came to the warehouse last night. The last gamble of a man with nowhere left to run. Lestrade exhaled, and the river claimed him. Holmes's expression grew thoughtful. Perhaps he will resurface. Some criminals have the uncanny ability to cheat even the Thames. He turned toward the hearth. But one detail remains of great importance. Edwin Harrow's courage ensured the destruction of Richter's empire. Without the genuine manifests, we would have lacked proof. Edwin paid with his life, but he ensured that the truth survived him. The room fell silent. After a long moment, Lestrade cleared his throat. "Holmes, the Yard owes you a great debt. I'll see to it personally that Edwin Harrow's name is cleared entirely. His bravery deserves recognition." Holmes nodded. "Indeed." Lestrade stood. "I'll take these documents back. There's a mountain of clerical work ahead of us, and a line of smugglers waiting for their new accommodations at Her Majesty's expense." Holmes inclined his head. Lestrade gathered the bundle and departed, leaving the door ajar in his haste. When he was gone, Holmes sank into his chair, lighting his pipe with a weary motion. "Well, Watson," he said, exhaling a thin plume of smoke. "Another tragedy concluded. London is marginally safer today, but at a cost not soon forgotten." I watched him in the firelight, the thin blue smoke drifting upward, the lines of fatigue etched subtly around his eyes, the strange, quiet sadness that always returned at the end of a particularly bitter case. "What troubles you, Holmes?" I asked softly. He stared into the flames. "That two men, alike in every physical respect, should be separated entirely by their choices. One fell to ambition, the other rose to courage, and yet both met the same fate." After a moment, he added, "Justice is a peculiar thing, Watson. It rights the scales, but sometimes it cannot mend what is broken." I said nothing. There was nothing to say. Holmes leaned back, closing his eyes. "Let us hope," he murmured, "that the next inquiry brings less sorrow." But something in his tone suggested he did not truly expect it. For several days after the conclusion of the Harrow affair, Holmes maintained an unusual quiet. He read little, smoked less, and spent long intervals standing at the sitting-room window, gazing down upon Baker Street with an expression I could not easily decipher. It was not melancholy. Holmes seldom indulged in that luxury, but rather a contemplative stillness, as though his mind were turning over some final, elusive fragment of the case. London, meanwhile, reacted swiftly. The papers brimmed with news of a dramatic crackdown upon a smuggling ring of considerable scale and ingenuity. Several arrests were made across the East End. Thorne confessed under pressure, revealing enough detail to convict half a dozen accomplices and expose a network of illicit warehouses stretching from Wapping to Rotherhithe. Brewster and Vickers, terrified by the prospect of hard labour, corroborated the story fully. As for Richter, the river kept its secret. No body surfaced. The Thames, ever capricious, sometimes surrenders its dead, sometimes it guards them. Holmes offered no speculation, and I refrained from prompting him. On the 5th morning following the affair, A knock sounded at our door shortly after breakfast. Mrs. Hudson's ushered in a small, timidly postured gentleman carrying a worn hat in his hands. He introduced himself as Mr. Joseph Harrow, the elder brother of Edwin and Ernest. The resemblance was faint, detectable only in the shape of the mouth and the arch of the brow. Joseph was older by many years, with stooped shoulders and the habitual caution of a man who has known more grief than comfort. He seated himself with visible difficulty. "I hope I am not intruding," he said softly. "Inspector Lestrade advised that I speak with Mr. Holmes directly. I wish to understand what truly befell my brothers." Holmes regarded him with a gentleness few outside our small circle ever witnessed. "You are not intruding in the least, Mr. Harrow. You have the right to know all that we do." Holmes summarized the events in his precise, tactful manner, omitting the more brutal details, but never obscuring the truth. Joseph listened in silence, his weathered hands clutching his hat as though it were an anchor against shifting seas. When Holmes finished, Joseph closed his eyes. "They were twins," he whispered. "Identical in body, yes, but not in spirit. Edwin was born gentle. Ernest was always chasing dreams too large for him. I feared he might come to harm, but I never imagined." His voice grew hoarse. "Never imagined this." Holmes leaned forward. "Your brother Edwin acted with remarkable bravery. Without his intervention, Richter's conspiracy might have flourished unchecked. He died protecting the truth." Joseph bowed his head. "It comforts me to hear it." He rose slowly. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, thank you for giving my family the dignity of truth, even if the truth is painful." Holmes stood and offered his hand. Joseph shook it with quiet sincerity, then took his leave. When the door closed, Holmes remained motionless for a long moment. Then he returned to his chair and lit his pipe with deliberate precision. "A hard visit," I said. Holmes exhaled a thin stream of smoke. "Necessary, however. Truth is rarely gentle, Watson, but it is always kinder than ignorance." I could not argue with that. The morning wore on. Holmes resumed his customary habits, pacing intermittently, scanning newspapers, examining the pipes in his rack with fastidious attention. The gravity that had clung to him since Richter's disappearance seemed finally to lift. Yet I sensed the case was not entirely behind him. Near midday, as sunlight glimmered weakly across the street, Holmes spoke without looking up from his paper. "There remains one curiosity, Watson." "Oh?" Holmes folded the newspaper and set it aside. "The matter of Richter's fate. While the river may have claimed him, I cannot help but recall the look in his eyes as he fell." "A look?" I asked. "Of calculation," Holmes replied. "Not fear. Richter feared the yard, yes, but he feared confinement more. Men of his sort often plan an escape even in their dying moments." "You believe he survived?" Holmes tapped the ash from his pipe. "It is possible. The Thames conceals as much as it reveals. If he reached the underside of the pier, or if a boat lay concealed beneath the fog." He paused. "I cannot be certain." "And does that trouble you?" Holmes gave a faint, inscrutable smile. "Not excessively. Richter's empire is shattered, his network dismantled. Should he reappear, he will find London a less forgiving city. No man escapes the consequences of his choices forever." I nodded, though I suspected Holmes would not easily forget such an adversary. Around 3 o'clock, Lestrade returned, flushed with the satisfaction of a man who has just handed a stack of damning evidence to a very senior official. "It's finished, Holmes," he declared. Every last ledger, every forged manifest, every coded account, catalogued, stamped and sealed. The Yard is in rare good humor today. I should hope so, Holmes replied dryly. You have dismantled a criminal organization of considerable sophistication. Lestrade grinned. Can't take all the credit. You and the doctor here were the ones who untangled the knots. Holmes untangled them, I corrected. I merely kept pace as best I could. Holmes gave me a brief, appreciative glance. Lestrade lingered only a few minutes more before hurrying off to present his final report. His footsteps clattered down the stairs, leaving Holmes and me alone once again. The sitting room felt unusually still. The fog had finally lifted, revealing the bustle of London resuming its afternoon rhythm. A newsboy shouted headlines across the street. The clatter of a passing carriage drifted faintly through the open window. Holmes stood by the fireplace, pipe in hand, gazing into the flames. Watson, he said quietly, cases such as this remind us that the world often turns on the smallest of unnoticed details. The note in Edwin's coat, I said. Precisely. A slip of paper no larger than a calling card, overlooked by the police, dismissed as trivial. Yet it contained the fulcrum upon which 2 lives and the fate of an entire criminal enterprise rested. He turned toward me. It is ever thus. The detective's art is not in seeing more than others, but in seeing what others neglect. And this time, I said, you saw clearly. He gave a modest incline of his head. The credit belongs as much to Edwin Harrow as to anyone. His final act provided the key. Holmes returned to his chair and settled himself with an air of closure. Well, Watson, another chapter is complete. You may record it in your chronicles under such title as you deem fit. I smiled. I already have a title in mind. Holmes raised an eyebrow. Oh, The Victim Who Died Twice. Holmes considered it for a moment, then allowed a rare, soft chuckle. Appropriate. Quite appropriate. Outside, the sun dipped behind a row of chimneys, casting long shadows across Baker Street. The day's final light glimmered briefly through our window before fading into evening. A fresh mystery would inevitably arrive soon enough. But for that moment, brief and welcome, Sherlock Holmes allowed himself the luxury of rest.